Callum was a widowed tanner who wanted nothing from the village but distance. That ended the night a lone orc assassin collapsed against his door, a crossbow bolt buried in her side and venom already graying her skin. He knew what she was. Everyone in the valley knew the shadow-marked killer who left no witnesses. He dragged her inside anyway, worked through the night to draw the poison, and hid her beneath the floorboards when the search party came. The village seethed with suspicion. Then the truth broke open. When the orc woman woke, fevered and rambling, she clutched a leather cord around her neck. Callum recognized the braided knotwork as his own, taught to him by his late wife. Inside the pouch was a lock of hair the exact shade as his daughter's, the child taken during a border raid 8 years ago and presumed dead. The reason he saved her wasn't mercy. It was recognition. Callum had spent 8 years grieving a daughter he believed was dead. Now, in his hidden root cellar, the proof that she lived was burning with fever. Her green skin a mask forced upon her by the same orcs who had stolen her. The village of Thornwood already saw him as a recluse, who spoke too little and worked too steadily with a blade. The moment they learned he was sheltering the valley's most wanted killer, they wouldn't wait for an explanation. They would hang him first, and ask questions never. And the assassin, his daughter, was too sick to speak a single word in her own defense. He had maybe a day to find a way to prove the impossible before the mob found him. Callum had been a soldier once, before the tanner's apron and the quiet cottage at the forest's edge. He had left the border wars behind when his wife Elara became pregnant, trading a long sword for a tooled leather knife and a promise of peace. The raids were supposed to be over. The treaty with the northern orc clans had held for 6 seasons, but in the 8th year of their daughter's life, the Bleakstone Warband came south like a storm no parchment could stop. They hit Thornwood at dusk. Callum had been in the tannery when the screaming started. By the time he reached the cottage, the door was splintered. Elara lay on the threshold with a spear through her chest, her hand still reaching toward the empty crib. Lily was gone. The raiding party had taken 4 children that night. 3 were found dead within a week, their small bodies discarded at the forest's edge as if the raiders had no use for them. The 4th, Lily, was never found. The official search lasted a month. Callum's private search lasted years. He tracked every rumor, bribed every caravan guard, followed every whisper of a human child seen among the northern clans. Every path led to silence. Eventually, the village of Thornwood stopped asking why the tanner's eyes were so hollow. They stopped offering condolences. They stopped speaking to him altogether when he moved his workshop to the forest boundary, a place where the law of the village gave way to the law of the trees. 8 years of grief had turned Callum into a ghost on his own land. He was tolerated because his leather was strong and his prices were fair. But if you cornered any elder in Thornwood and asked them what they truly thought of the widower at the wood's edge, they would tell you the same thing. Broken men are dangerous. They have nothing left to lose. The orc assassin was a legend before she was a patient on his workshop floor. For 3 years, the Shadow of Bleakstone had been the most feared name on the northern trade routes. Noble caravans carrying silver and iron would leave the mountain passes with full guards and vanish before they reached the lowlands. The only survivors were those who had been left at the outskirts of the carnage, always with the same message carved into a nearby tree, a curved blade intersecting a crescent moon. The mark of a killer the Bleakstone clan had trained from childhood, a weapon they had honed to perfection. The descriptions were always the same: a female orc, tall and lean, green-skinned, eyes like embers. She moved through shadows, she left no tracks. She never spoke. The bounty on her head was 800 silver crowns, enough to buy a farmstead 3 times over. And now she was lying on a pile of uncured hides in a tanner's hidden root cellar, her breath shallow and her blood seeping through the bandages Callum had tied with hands that once knew how to dress a battlefield wound. He had pulled the crossbow bolt from her side 3 hours ago. The head was barbed and coated with a paste that smelled of nightshade and iron rot. A poison designed to kill slowly, painfully, and with maximum suffering. Whoever had shot her had wanted her to die alone in the woods, crawling through the underbrush until her body gave out. She had made it to his door instead. Callum had worked by candlelight, using a small knife heated over a flame and the stitching techniques he had learned sewing leather for armor. His hands had not shaken. They had not shaken since the war. That was the curse of the training the army had given him. Under pressure, his body became calm, whether his mind wanted it to or not. He had flushed the wound with boiled wine and packed it with yarrow and charcoal. He had done everything a field medic could do. And still, her skin was cooling, her pulse threading slower and slower. The necklace was what changed everything. He had been wiping the blood from her collarbone when he saw it. A thin leather cord cinched around her throat, the knotwork tight and intricate. His hands stopped. He knew that braid. He had watched Alara tie that exact pattern 1,000 times. She had called it a healer's knot, a binding charm her grandmother had taught her to weave into the cords that held poultices in place. Callum had tried to learn it once, fumbling with the thongs, and Alara had laughed and guided his fingers. The memory hit him like a fist. He pulled the cord free. A small leather pouch dangled from the end. Inside was a lock of hair, fine and reddish-brown, the color of autumn leaves. The color of Lily's hair the last time he had seen her, tangled in the crib. Callum stared at the lock, then at the orc woman's face, and he saw past the green skin and the tusks and the ritual scars that had been carved into her cheeks. He saw the shape of his daughter's jaw. He saw the curve of his wife's brow. He saw the child he had spent 8 years believing was dead, remade into a weapon by the same monsters who had murdered her mother. The rambling started just before dawn. Her lips moved, cracked and bloodless, and the sounds that came out were fractured pieces of a life that had been stolen and reshaped. She spoke in a language that was half orcish, half human, the words colliding in her fever like driftwood in a flood. She said the Bleakstone chieftain's name, Garruk. She said something about the training pits, about the children who didn't survive the first winter, about a blade being pressed into her palm when she was 9 years old and being told to strike or be struck. She said the word that Callum had whispered into her crib every night for the first 5 years of her life. Lily, she said it with the accent of someone who had not heard the name spoken aloud in nearly a decade, but who had never stopped carrying it somewhere deep inside. And then she said the word he had not dared to hope for. Father. The search party had come at midday. Callum had heard the horses and boots before they reached his gate. He had dragged the cellar door shut and scattered fresh straw over the seam, then met them in the yard with the expression of a man who had nothing to hide. The leader was a man named Toller, the village blacksmith who had lost a son to a Bleakstone raid 2 years earlier. Toller's hatred of orcs was not political. It was personal. He carried a hammer in his belt and a grievance in his chest that had no outlet except violence. "We're tracking the shadow," Toller said, his eyes scanning the cottage. "The scouts found blood on the trail 1/2 mile east. It leads toward your property." Callum did not flinch. He smelled of tannin and wood smoke, and he offered the blacksmith a level gaze that his war training had taught him to manufacture under duress. "I've been rendering hide since dawn," he said. "Haven't seen anyone." Toller didn't believe him. Callum saw it in the way the blacksmith's knuckles tightened on the hammer. But a search required probable cause, and Callum's reputation for solitude was not yet a crime. "If you see anything," Toller said, "you send word." The unspoken threat hung in the air. "If you don't, and we find out you lied, we will come back. And we will not knock." They left. Callum waited until the sound of their horses faded, then sank against the splintered door and let the fear he had been holding breathe. Toller was not a patient man. The blood trail was real. It would take the scouts maybe a day to realize the trail ended at Callum's property and did not leave it. A day. He had a day, maybe less, to figure out how to prove that the monster the village wanted hanged was the same girl they had all mourned 8 years ago. And she was too sick to speak a single word in her own defense. Her fever was climbing. The wound was turning foul despite his stitching. He was losing her. He was losing her again, in the same cottage where he had lost everything once before. The rambling had stopped. The cellar was silent. And then, from below the floorboards, a voice that was not quite orc and not quite human, cracked and broken but unmistakably clear, spoke a single word, "Father." Callum froze. The word hung in the cellar air like a struck bell, vibrating through the damp and the darkness, and for a moment he could not move. He had dreamed of hearing Lily's voice for 8 years, and the voice that had spoken was not the voice of a child. It was rough, broken, layered with the guttural resonance of orcish throat structures. But it was his name, the name she had called him when she was small, before she learned the word daddy, before the raiders came and tore the world apart. He climbed down into the cellar, his hands finding the ladder rungs with the automatic precision of a man whose body knew how to move even when his mind was shattered. She was awake. Her eyes were open, glazed with fever, the irises a washed-out amber that held none of the ember intensity the village legends described. They were the eyes of a person who had been running on survival instinct for so long that consciousness was a fragile, borrowed thing. She looked at him, and he saw the struggle in her face. Recognition flickered like a candle in a draught. There, and then gone, and then there again. "I know you," she said. The words shaped slowly, as if her mouth was remembering a language it had been forbidden to speak. "I know your smell. Tannin and smoke and something else. I dreamed your smell. I dreamed it for years." Callum knelt beside her. His voice came out steadier than he felt. "Lily, your name is Lily Ashwood. You were born in the cottage above this cellar, on the first day of autumn, 8 summers ago. Your mother's name was Ilara. She sang you a song every night. A song about a sparrow and a willow tree. The words were in the old tongue. You used to hum it when you were scared." He began to hum the melody, the one Ilara had woven into the fabric of their home, the one Lily had carried into her crib and into her dreams. The orc woman's eyes went wide. Her cracked lips parted, and a sound came out that was not a word. It was the opening note of the sparrow song, wavering and weak, but unmistakably right. She remembered. Buried beneath 8 years of brutalization and conditioning and the merciless remaking of her body and mind, the melody had survived. It had been the one thing they could not take from her. Because it lived deeper than language, deeper than memory, in the place where the soul keeps what matters most. She wept. Orcs do not weep easily. Their tear ducts are smaller, their stoicism cultural and biological. But Lily Ashwood was not an orc. She was a human girl wearing an orc's skin, and the tears that tracked through the ritual scars on her cheeks were entirely human. They came silently. the way a person cries who learned long ago that making noise while showing weakness was punished. Callum reached out and took her hand. Her fingers were long, tipped with claws that had been sharpened for combat, and they closed around his with a gentleness that said she had not forgotten how to be held. "I'm sorry," she said. "I killed people. I hurt them. I didn't want to. I couldn't stop." The words came in fragments, each one pulled from a different layer of consciousness, fever and guilt and exhaustion all tangling together. The Bleakstone chieftain, Garrock, he took the children who survived the first winter, and he put them in the pits. If you didn't fight, you died. If you fought and lost, you died. If you cried, you died. I stopped crying. I stopped everything. I became what he wanted me to become because the alternative was a shallow grave in the snow with the others. They changed my skin with alchemy. They filed my teeth to points. They gave me a blade and a target, and they told me that this was the only life I would ever have. And I believed them. Callum listened. He did not interrupt, did not offer the hollow comforts of a parent who could not understand because there were no comforts that fit these wounds. He simply held her hand and let her speak, because speaking was the first step toward reclaiming the self that had been buried alive. After a long silence, she stirred. "There was something else," she said. "Something I need to tell you. The raid that brought me here. I wasn't sent to kill anyone. I was running. Running from what? From Garrock. From the clan. They found out what I was, how they found out. A traveler came to the stronghold 3 moons ago. A human merchant from Thornwood. He saw me training in the yard. He recognized my face. He said I looked like someone he used to know. A tanner's wife named Ilara. He said I had her eyes." Callum's blood went cold. Who was the merchant? I don't know his name. He was old, with a scar on his cheek. He told Garrock that the shadow of Bleakstone was not an orc, but a stolen human child. Garrock killed him on the spot. But the damage was done. The other chieftains heard. They said the shadow was corrupted, that I was a spy sent from the lowlands, that I had to be destroyed. Garrock did not defend me. He ordered my execution. I ran. I ran south, toward the only place I could remember from the dreams. The cottage by the forest. The smell of tannin. The song. I followed the song. Callum closed his eyes. The old merchant with the scar on his cheek could only be Orin Tallow, the trader who had passed through Thornwood every spring and autumn for 3 decades. Orin had known Ilara. He had bounced Lily on his knee when she was an infant. He had disappeared 9 months ago on a northern trade route. Everyone assumed he had been killed by bandits. Now Callum knew the truth. Orin had seen the impossible, and it had cost him his life. But before he died, he had given Lily a direction. He had pointed her toward home, and she had followed the only map she still carried, the memory of a scent and a song and a father she should not have been able to remember, but did. Callum lifted her hand and pressed it to his forehead, a gesture from the old war days, the way soldiers honored fallen comrades. Then he did what he had not done since the day they told him his daughter was dead. He prayed. Not to the gods the priests talked about, but to the memory of Ilara. He asked her to give him the strength to do what came next. Because what came next was going to require more than courage. It was going to require proof. Every child born in Thornwood was recorded in the village ledger by the midwife who delivered them. The midwife who had delivered Lily was a woman named Marta Fenwick, now 73 years old, the last of the old blood healers who had served the valley before the border wars brought army surgeons and modern medicine. Marta had retired from midwifery 5 years ago, but she still lived in the village, in a small cottage by the Weaver's Hall. She was known for three things: a memory that had not dulled with age, a tongue that did not soften uncomfortable truths, and a complete refusal to be intimidated by anyone. If anyone in Thornwood could verify that the orc woman lying in Callum's cellar was Lily Ashwood, it was Marta Fenwick, and if Callum could convince her to do so, it would be the first crack in the wall of disbelief that the village would build around him the moment they discovered the truth. He left Lily in the cellar with water and a cold compress against her wound. The fever had not broken, but the yarrow paste was working. The poison was receding. She would live if infection did not set in. He told her to stay quiet, to not move, to trust that he would return. She looked at him with the eyes of a child who had been told many promises by people who intended to break them, and she nodded anyway, because she had no other choice. Callum walked to the village under a sky that was just beginning to lighten, the gray pre-dawn that made the world feel suspended between night and consequence. The walk took 20 minutes. He spent every one of them rehearsing what he would say, and every version sounded insane. By the time he knocked on Marta Fenwick's door, he had decided to simply tell the truth and let it land where it landed. Marta answered in her nightrobe, a shawl thrown over her shoulders, her white hair in the single tight braid she had worn every day since her husband died. She looked at Callum with the expression of a woman who had seen too much of life to be surprised by anything, but was still capable of being irritated by bad timing. "Tanner, it's before the sun. This had better be worth the candle I'm going to burn heating water for tea." "It's about Lily," Callum said. Marta's hand stilled on the doorframe. No one had spoken that name to her in years, except in the past tense. Callum Ashwood's dead daughter was a sorrow the village had folded into its collective memory and closed the book on. To hear her name spoken in the present tense, before dawn, by the father who had never accepted the closure, was not a small thing. Marta's sharp old eyes studied his face. She saw something there, something that was not grief and not madness, but a third thing she could not immediately name. "Come inside," she said. Callum told her everything. The orc assassin collapsing at his door, the crossbow bolt, the leather cord with Ilara's knotwork, the lock of hair, the song Lily had hummed in the cellar, the merchant with the scarred cheek, the flight from the Bleakstone stronghold. Marta listened without interrupting. When he finished, she poured herself a cup of tea with hands that were steady only because decades of discipline had made them so, and said the only thing that mattered. "You'll need me to identify the child. I birthed her. I know her marks." She had a small brown mole behind her right ear, shaped like a willow leaf, and a scar on her left shoulder from where she fell against the hearthstone when she was learning to walk. 3 stitches. I did them myself. If those marks are on the orc woman's body, then that woman is Lily Ashwood, no matter what color her skin is or how many teeth they filed. If they are not, then you are deluded, and I will not help you hide a killer from the village." Callum nodded. "That's all I ask." They returned to the cottage as the sun broke over the tree line. Marta carried her healer's bag, the same leather satchel she had carried to hundreds of births and deaths, and she followed Callum into the root cellar with the unflinching stride of a woman who had once delivered twins during a thunderstorm in a barn and considered that merely a Tuesday. Lily was still awake, her breathing shallow, her eyes tracking Marta's movements with the wariness of a cornered animal. Marta knelt beside her. She did not flinch at the green skin or the tusks or the scars. She had seen too many bodies in too many conditions to flinch. She simply said, "Child, I'm going to look behind your ear and at your shoulder. Do not be afraid. I am not here to hurt you." Lily looked at Callum, who nodded. She turned her head. Marta brushed the matted hair away from the back of Lily's ear and there it was. A small brown mole, the size of a grain of barley, shaped exactly like a willow leaf. Marta's breath caught, but she said nothing. She moved to the shoulder, carefully pulling aside the torn tunic, and found the scar. 3 inches long, slightly raised, the stitch marks still faintly visible beneath the green pigmentation. 3 stitches, exactly as she remembered. Marta Fenwick sat back on her heels. Her eyes, which had been dry for 20 years, filled with tears. "It's her," she said. "By the old gods and the new, it's Lily. She's come home." The confirmation should have been a relief, and in some part of Callum's chest it was. But relief was a brief visitor, because even as Marta spoke the words, the sound of horses reached them from the yard. Many horses. And voices. Toller's voice, loud and hard, and carrying the weight of a man who had been cheated and knew it. The blacksmith had returned. And this time, he had brought the village. Callum climbed out of the cellar, sealing the door behind him. Marta followed, her face set in the grim expression of a woman who had just been handed a truth someone else was going to have to accept, and who was already preparing for the fight. The yard was full. 20 villagers at least, Toller at the front with his hammer in his belt and a torch in his hand, because he had come prepared to smoke out whatever was hiding. The scouts had found the blood trail. It ended at Callum's door, and Toller was no longer asking permission. "Step aside, Tanner," Toller said. "We know she's in there. We're taking her." Callum did not step aside. He stood in front of the cottage door with nothing but his hands at his sides and the weight of 8 years of grief behind his eyes. "If you take her," he said, "you'll be killing my daughter." The words landed in the crowd like a stone in still water, rippling outward in waves of confusion and disbelief. Toller's face twisted. "Your daughter is dead. We all mourned her." "What are you talking about?" Callum raised his voice so everyone could hear. "The orc assassin you're hunting is not an orc. She's a human woman. She was stolen as a child by the Bleakstone clan and remade into their weapon. I have proof. I have the midwife who delivered her. I have the marks on her body. I have the lock of hair she carries in a pouch around her neck. The woman in my cellar is Lily Ashwood." For a long moment, nobody spoke. The silence was the kind of silence that comes before a storm, charged and dangerous and balanced on a knife's edge. Then Toller laughed. It was not a kind laugh. It was the laugh of a man who had lost a son to orc blades and who had no room left in his heart for complicated truths. "You expect us to believe that the shadow of Bleakstone, the killer who's been terrorizing the trade routes for 3 years, is your little girl, all grown up and painted green. You've lost your mind. You've been alone too long." The crowd murmured agreement. Fear and hatred were simpler than the story Callum was telling, and simpler always won in a crowd. Marta stepped forward. She was small and old and looked like a strong wind could carry her away, but when she spoke, the authority in her voice cut through the noise like a blade through cloth. "I delivered Lily Ashwood," she said. "I stitched the scar on her left shoulder. I know the mole behind her right ear. I have just examined the woman in that cellar, and both marks are present. She is human. She was taken. What you are about to do is murder a child of this village who has already suffered more than any of you can imagine. If you have any fear of the gods or any respect for the truth, you will lower your weapons and listen." The crowd wavered. Some of the older villagers knew Marta trusted her. But Toller's grief was a furnace that burned away reason. He raised his torch higher. "Bring her out," he said. "If she's really Lily, let us see her. Let her speak. Let her prove it." The mob roared agreement. "Bring her out! Bring her out!" Callum knew he had no choice. If he refused, they would burn the cottage. They would find the cellar anyway. The only way through this was through it. He turned, walked inside, and descended into the cellar one last time. Lily was trying to stand, her face pale and wet with sweat, her hand gripping the wall for support. "They want to see you," he said. "I know." She straightened her spine. The movement was the movement of a soldier, not a child. 8 years of training did not vanish just because the truth had been spoken. She had been forged into a weapon, and weapons stand when they are called to stand. "I'll go," she said. "But Papa, I don't know if I can be her anymore. The girl I was. I don't know if she's still in there." Callum took her hand. "She is. I heard her singing." They walked out together. The crowd fell silent at the sight of her. The orc assassin, the shadow of Bleakstone, was not a towering monster but a broken woman, gaunt and fevered, leaning on the arm of a tanner. Toller's torch illuminated the ritual scars on her face, the tusks, the green skin, and his hand tightened on the hammer. But then Lily lifted her head and looked at the crowd, and something in her eyes shifted. The mask of the killer fell away, and beneath it was the face of a girl who had been stolen, tormented, and was now standing in front of the village that had given up on her. She spoke, and her voice was quiet but clear. "I remember the well in the square," she said. "I remember the big oak tree with the swing. I remember Marta's garden with the yellow flowers. I remember the song my mother sang." She began to hum the sparrow song, the melody that had survived the pits and the poison and the long brutal years, and one by one, the villagers who had known Alara Ashwood recognized the tune. Hands covered mouths. Someone began to weep. Toller's torch dipped, the flame shuddering, because Toller, for all his rage and grief, had a memory too. He remembered a little girl with autumn-colored hair who used to wave at him from her father's shoulders as he hammered at the forge. He remembered her laughing and calling his name. Toller, the silence that fell over the crowd was heavier than any accusation. It was the weight of a truth too vast to process all at once. The monster they had come to kill was not a monster. She was Lily Ashwood. And she was standing in front of them, alive, for the first time in 8 years. And nobody knew what to do next. Toller's torch had burned low, the flame guttering in the morning breeze, but he did not drop it. He stood frozen, the hammer still heavy at his belt, his face a battlefield between grief and the impossible truth he could not unsee. The girl he had once lifted onto his anvil to watch the sparks fly was standing in front of him, wearing the skin of a monster. The other villagers had edged back, forming a loose half-circle around Callum and Lily, their fear now mixed with something more destabilizing: doubt. Marta Fenwick did not wait for anyone to find their courage. She stepped forward, her voice cutting through the silence with the practiced authority of a woman who had delivered half the village into the world and was not about to let them forget it. "If you're going to stand there like stunned cattle, at least put down the weapons. This child is burning with fever. She needs a clean bed, not a mob." But no one moved. The fear that had welded them together was cracking, but the hatred that had brought them here was looking for a new target. A voice from the back of the crowd, young and sharp with the certainty of someone who had never lost a child, called out, "She's still the shadow. She killed those caravans. Marta's marks don't change what she did." The murmur returned, uglier now. Callum felt Lily's weight shift against him, and when he glanced down, she was looking at the crowd not with fear, but with a hollow resignation. She had expected this. She had lived among warriors who understood that a weapon was never blamed for the blood it shed, but she also remembered enough of human law to know that her father's people were not so forgiving. Inside the cottage, they laid Lily on Callum's own bed, and Marta set to work with boiled water and clean linen and a poultice of comfrey she had brought in her satchel. The crossbow wound had stopped seeping, but the flesh around it was angry and hot. Marta worked with the swift, sure movements of a healer who had learned her craft during the border wars, when there was no time for gentleness. "She'll live," Marta said quietly to Callum, "but the fever needs to break in the next 12 hours, or the poison will settle in her blood. And that's not what's going to kill her." Callum understood. Outside, the village was convening its own kind of council. He could hear the voices rising and falling through the thin walls, Toller arguing with someone, other voices joining in. The village of Thornwood had not faced a crisis like this in living memory. They were farmers and smiths and weavers, not magistrates. The only law was the Elder Council, a body of 5 who settled land disputes and punished petty theft. They were not equipped to decide the fate of a woman who was both victim and executioner, but they were going to decide anyway, because the alternative was anarchy. Callum stepped outside alone, leaving Marta with Lily. The crowd had grown, word spreading faster than fire. And now, 40 or 50 villagers filled the yard and spilled onto the forest path. The Elder Council had arrived. 3 of them, at least. Elder Henrik, a grizzled former soldier who had lost an eye at the siege of Northwatch. Elder Tessa, the weaver's guild mistress, whose goods had been stolen in a caravan raid 2 winters ago, and Elder Merrick, the village headman, a man of careful words and even more careful indecision. Toller stood before them, his face red with the effort of containing his rage. "She's a killer. I don't care whose daughter she is. Justice doesn't stop being justice because the story is sad. She has to answer for the people she murdered. My son died fighting Bleakstone raiders. And now you want me to shelter one of their weapons?" He was not wrong. And that was the crux of the nightmare. Henrik, who had known Callum during the war, looked at the tanner with an expression that was not unkind, but was not merciful either. "Callum, the girl is yours by blood, but by deed she is an enemy of the realm. Lord Aldrich's tax caravans were hit 3 times, 27 guards dead. The Lord has a new magistrate who will want a hanging." The mention of Lord Aldrich sent a fresh chill through the gathering. Thornwood was a freeholding village, but it lay within the jurisdiction of Thornwood Keep, where Lord Aldrich Ironhand commanded a garrison of 100 mounted swords. The shadow had been a stain on his ledger for years, and a lord who couldn't protect his own trade routes was a lord who looked weak. If Aldrich learned that the assassin was being sheltered in one of his own villages, his response would not be a polite inquiry. It would be a column of soldiers with drawn swords. Then the first real twist landed. A boy of 12, the son of a woodcutter, came running up the forest path, gasping for breath. "There's smoke," he said, pointing north. "Big smoke, coming from the old watchtower ridge." I climbed the oak, and I saw it. It's not a cook fire. It's beacon smoke. Every adult in the yard knew what beacon smoke meant. During the border wars, the northern watchtowers had been used to signal raiding parties. They had been abandoned for a decade, but the Bleakstone clan knew them well. If someone was lighting the beacons now, it was not for a celebration. Elder Merrick's face went pale. "How many plumes?" he asked. The boy held up 2 fingers. 2. And they're black. Real black. 2 black plumes from the Watchtower Ridge, the old code for an approaching war party of 50 or more. The Bleakstone clan was coming. The yard erupted into chaos. Mothers grabbed their children and ran toward the village center, where the stockade gates could be barred. The men began shouting about weapons and barricades, their earlier argument about justice instantly swallowed by the more immediate threat of annihilation. Toller's anger did not disappear, but it found a new target. "This is because of her," he said, spinning on Callum. "They're coming for her. You brought this on us. Callum did not deny it. The logic was inescapable. Lily had escaped the Bleakstone stronghold, and Garrick was not the kind of chieftain who let a weapon simply walk away. She knew his secrets, his training methods, his hidden supply caches, the identities of the other stolen children he had remade into killers. She was a liability, and he would burn the valley to the ground to silence her. But Callum also knew something else. If they're lighting the beacons, they're not hiding, he said, his voice low but steady. Garrick wants us to know he's coming. He wants us afraid. Fear is a weapon. He's using it now, before his first warrior crosses the ridge. Henrik, the old soldier, nodded slowly. He's right. A raiding party that wants surprise doesn't announce itself with beacon fires. This is a message. He's giving us a choice. What choice? Toller demanded. Surrender the shadow, or watch your village burn, Callum said. The words fell like stones. Everyone understood that the choice was not a choice at all. Hand over a dying woman to be executed by the clan that had enslaved her, or fight a hopeless battle against an orc warband that outnumbered them 3-1. Thornwood had no standing army. It had farmers with pitchforks and a blacksmith with a hammer. Inside the cottage, Lily had heard the commotion. When Callum went back to check on her, she was sitting up, her eyes clearer than they had been since the night she collapsed. The fever had not broken, but something had changed. She had heard the word beacon, and her training, the brutal conditioning Garrick had drilled into her for 8 years, had clicked into place. He won't just burn the village, she said, her voice a dry rasp. He'll take the children. Every child under 10. That's what he does. He replaces his losses. The stronghold has pits full of children being turned into what I am. If he comes here, it won't be quick. It will be systematic. And then he'll make the survivors watch while he kills the ones who sheltered me. Callum knelt beside the bed. How many warriors does he have with him? Lily closed her eyes, as if reading a map she had memorized long ago. If it's a full retrieval party, 60 at least. Maybe more if he brought the broken ones. Broken ones? The ones like me. The ones who aren't finished yet. He uses them as shock troops. They're not as skilled, but they don't feel pain the same way. He gives them a stimulant before battle. They'll fight until their hearts give out. This was the second blow, the one that made the first seem almost manageable. The Bleakstone Warband was not just a collection of raiders. It was a war machine that had spent years perfecting the art of terror, and it was being led by a chieftain who had turned child abduction into an industry. And at the center of it all was Lily, the one weapon he could not afford to lose publicly, because her existence proved that his orc supremacy ideology was built on a lie. If the other clans learned that the Shadow was a human, Garrick's authority would crumble. He needed her dead, and he needed the proof destroyed. The village was not just collateral damage, it was the evidence. Marta, who had been listening from the corner, spoke up. Then we need to send for Lord Aldrich. If the Bleakstone are coming in force, this is no longer a village matter. It's a border incursion. The Lord is obligated to defend his holdings. Aldrich's keep is a day's ride south, Henrik said. Even if we sent a rider now, his garrison wouldn't arrive until noon tomorrow. The beacons put the warband at the ridge by sunset. They'll be at our gates by nightfall. Then we don't have a day, Toller said, the heat in his voice now tempered by a cold pragmatism. We have until nightfall, so we make a decision. We either give them what they want, or we dig in and pray. The council reconvened in the village hall, a long, low building of timber and stone where the elders had settled disputes for 5 generations. Lily was brought in, wrapped in a blanket, flanked by Callum and Marta. She insisted on walking. though every step cost her visible pain. The villagers who had crowded into the hall, every face tight with fear, saw her not as the shadow now, but as a weapon that had been pointed at them, but was now, just maybe, pointing the other direction. Elder Merrick called for order. "We have two paths," he said, his voice thin but steady. "We can release the woman to the Bleakstone, hoping they will spare the village, or we can fight, and try to hold them off until Lord Aldrich's soldiers arrive. I will not pretend either path is good. I am asking for your voices." Toller spoke first. "We give her up." The words were blunt, but the agony behind them was not. This was the same man who had cradled the memory of his dead son for 2 years, who had sharpened his hatred into a weapon he thought he would never have to put down. And now, to protect the other children of the village, he was being asked to sacrifice the child of someone else. It was not justice. It was triage, and he hated himself for offering it. Others nodded, shamefaced, but silent. A mother with a baby at her breast looked at Lily with eyes that pleaded for understanding. "We have children too." Then Callum stepped forward. He did not shout. He did not beg. He spoke the way he had learned to speak in the war, when his commanding officer had asked for a tactical assessment before a doomed engagement. "If you give her up, Garrock will still burn this village." The hall went quiet, not because he wants to, because he has to. Lily is not just a deserter. She is a secret that, if it spreads, will unravel his alliance. He has spent years telling the other clans that the Shadow is proof of Orc superiority, a weapon born of pure blood and relentless training. If the truth comes out that she is a human girl, stolen and altered, every chieftain who has ever envied Garrock will use it to dismantle him. He cannot leave witnesses. He cannot leave a single person in this valley who has seen her face and heard her story. Surrendering her will not save you. It will just guarantee that when he kills you, you will have given up the only asset we have that might help us survive. Elder Henrik, the old soldier, leaned forward. "What asset?" Callum turned to Lily. She straightened, the blanket slipping from her shoulder, revealing the edge of the ritual scars that marked her as a killer. But her eyes, when she lifted them to the assembly, were clear and calculating. This was the part of her that Garrock had forged, turned now against its creator. "I know how he fights," she said. "I know the beacon system he's using. I know the stimulant his shock troops need, and how long it lasts before they collapse. I know the passwords his scouts use, the frequencies of their signal horns, and the exact layout of the camp he will build outside your walls. Most importantly, I know the one thing he's actually afraid of." "What's that?" Toller asked, despite himself. Lily's voice dropped. "Fire in the dry creek bed." The southern approach to this village runs through a ravine filled with dead brush, hasn't been cleared in a decade. A warband moving through that ravine at dusk, with the wind blowing down canyon, is walking into a furnace. Garrock knows this. He will send scouts to check if the brush has been burned back. If they find it dry and untouched, he will march straight through it. If they find it cleared, he'll circle east, adding 3 hours to his approach and buying us time. She paused. If they find it rigged to burn on command, he loses half his force before the first sword is drawn. The hall was silent. The kind of silence that follows a lightning strike, when everyone is waiting for the thunder. A woman who had been a terror of the trade routes 3 hours ago was now drawing up a battle plan as if she had been on their side all along. Because, in the deepest and most twisted sense, she always had been. Her body had been a weapon aimed at the world, but the hand that pulled the trigger was Garrock's. Now the weapon was offering to aim itself at its former master. The moral calculus was still ugly, but the strategic calculus had just shifted dramatically. Toller looked at the woman who had once been the little girl waving from her father's shoulders, and he saw not a monster but a soldier. He knew soldiers. He had been one, briefly, before the forge. He understood what it cost to carry the weight of violence you did not choose. Without another word, he walked to the weapon rack on the wall, lifted a heavy iron-studded mace, and set it on the table. "Then we fight," he said. "But if we survive this, the Lord's justice still waits. Her crimes don't vanish. I want that known." Callum met his eyes. "When the battle is over, I will answer for her to Aldrich myself. But right now, we have a village to save." One by one, the other men and women of Thornwood came forward and took up what arms they had: pitchforks, wood axes, hunting bows. Marta began organizing the treatment tents, preparing for the wounded. The children were gathered into the stone cellar beneath the hall, the only building that could withstand fire. And Lily, the assassin, became the strategist. The sun was already dipping past midday when Callum led a group of 5 to the southern ravine with torches and flint and barrels of lamp oil. Lily's plan was simple in concept, monstrous in execution. They would rig the brush line with oil-soaked rags and kindling, then light it from 3 points when the warband entered the ravine. The wind would do the rest. The fire would consume the brush, the orcs caught in the canyon would burn or suffocate, and the survivors would emerge into a village that had already marshaled its defenses at the sole exit. It was not honorable warfare. It was butchery. But the village was outnumbered 7 to 1, and honor was a luxury reserved for those who could afford it. As Callum worked, he thought of Alara, who had believed in peace, and who had died trying to shield their daughter from the very violence he was now methodically preparing to unleash. He thought of the years he had spent lost in grief, learning nothing except how to preserve dead skins. And he thought of the girl in the cottage, burning with fever, who had taught herself to hum a sparrow song in the darkness of a bleak stone pit. If there was any way to redeem the horror of what she had been forced to become, it began tonight. And if there wasn't, it would end tonight too. But either way, Garruk would not take another child from this valley. That was the promise Callum made to himself as he poured the last of the lamp oil over the brush. No more stolen children. The warband came at dusk, just as Lily had predicted. The first warning was not a horn, but the ground itself, a low tremor that traveled through the soil of the ravine and set the birds to flight in a sudden panicked cloud. The villagers had taken their positions. Callum stood with a torch at the southern end of the dry creek bed, belly down in the dirt beside Toller and 3 other men. The rest of Thornwood's defenders, 40 farmers and craftsmen armed with whatever they could carry, waited in a shallow arc around the ravine's mouth, hidden behind felled trees and hastily stacked stone. They were not an army. They were parents and neighbors, and every one of them knew that if the fire failed, they would be dead before the moon rose. The orcs entered the ravine in a column of 2s, moving with the disciplined silence of seasoned raiders. At their head walked a massive figure in black iron plate, a crest of bleached bone rising from his helm, Garruk himself, recognizable even at a distance. Behind him, 60 warriors, their green skin darkened with war paint, their blades drawn. And among them, moving with a jerky, unnatural gait, were the Broken Ones. Lily's former cohort, children who had been taken and broken and rebuilt into weapons that did not feel pain. Callum counted 12 of them. They were the worst thing in the ravine, not because they were dangerous, but because they were victims. He would have to burn them too. He lit the torch. The flame caught the oil-soaked brush with a sound like a gasp, and within seconds the ravine was a river of fire. The wind, as Lily had said, funneled the blaze down canyon, feeding it into a wall of heat and smoke that moved faster than any living thing could outrun. The orcs in the column's center had no time to react. They were simply there, and then they were not, consumed so completely that their screams lasted only a heartbeat. The broken ones, their bodies already driven past the limits of endurance by the stimulant, charged forward into the flames as if they could not see them. And they, too, vanished. The fire did not discriminate between monster and victim. It simply burned. Garruk survived. Of course he did. The chieftain had thrown himself against the ravine wall behind an outcropping of stone, and when the firestorm passed, he emerged with his armor blackened and his cloak in ash, but alive. Behind him, perhaps 20 of his warriors had found similar shelter. They came out of the ravine into the killing ground that Thornwood had prepared, and the battle that followed was not clean. It was close and brutal and fought in the dying light of the fire, the air thick with smoke and the smell of charred flesh. Toller met the first orc to clear the ravine with his iron-studded mace, and the blow was so hard it shattered the warrior's shield and the arm behind it. Callum fought with a short sword he had not held since the war, his body remembering the movements his mind had tried to bury. The villagers fell too. 3 of them, then 5, their names cried out by those who loved them. But the orcs were broken, their formation shattered, their chieftain's command reduced to a raw fury. Garruk found Callum in the chaos. The chieftain was monstrous up close, 7 feet of muscle and rage, his tusks chipped from years of combat. "The shadow is mine," he snarled, swinging a great axe in a blow that would have bisected a horse. Callum ducked, rolled, and came up bleeding from a cut across his ribs. He was outmatched, and he knew it. But then a shape moved behind Garruk, small and silent, and the chieftain's swing stopped in mid-arc. Lily stood there, still wrapped in her father's blanket, her face ashen, and her wound weeping beneath the bandages, but in her hand was the same short fighting blade she had carried on 100 assassinations. She had come from the sickbed because she had heard her father's name shouted across the battlefield, and some things were stronger than fever. Garruk turned, and for the first time, the village saw the chieftain afraid. Not of the blade, but of the woman holding it. The weapon he had made turned against him. "You cannot kill me," he said. And it was not a boast. It was a plea. "I made you. I gave you strength. You were nothing before me." Lily looked at him, and what was in her eyes was not hatred. Hatred would have been easier. It was the hollow grief of a child looking at the monster who had stolen her life and realizing that she had nothing left to give him but an ending. "You made a weapon," she said. "But you didn't make me." She drove the blade upward, through the gap in his armor beneath the ribs, the same strike pattern he had taught her, the one designed to kill a larger opponent in a single motion. Garruk fell. The remaining orcs, seeing their chieftain dead and their numbers halved, broke and fled into the dark. They would not return. The village buried its dead the next morning under a soft rain that washed the ash from the air. 7 graves. 7 names added to the stone marker in the grass behind the hall. The grief was heavy, but it was not total. The children who had been hidden in the cellar emerged to find their parents alive, and that was a victory Thornwood would carry for a long time. Lily sat apart during the burials, wrapped in a clean wool cloak, her wound freshly dressed by Marta. She was too weak to stand for long, but she had insisted on being there. She did not speak the eulogies, but she listened to every one. Lord Aldrich's garrison arrived at midday, 100 riders in polished steel, led by a captain named Brecken, who was clearly expecting to find a smoking ruin, and instead found a village standing. The captain listened to Elder Merrick's account with a face that grew more incredulous by the minute. By the time the story reached Garruk's death, Brecken was simply staring at the woman wrapped in the wool cloak. "This is the shadow," he said, not a question. "She was," Callum said. "She is Lily Ashwood. She is my daughter." The captain's hand rested on his sword hilt. He had orders to bring the assassin to the keep for justice, and those orders did not account for complicated truths about stolen children. But then something happened that no one had anticipated. Toller stepped forward. The blacksmith, whose hatred for orcs had defined him for 2 years, placed himself between the captain and Lily. "She saved this village," he said, his voice rough and unsteady. "I saw her kill the chieftain with my own eyes. Without her, we would all be dead, and every child in Thornwood would be on its way to a bleak stone pit. If the Lord wants to put her on trial, he can do it. But I will stand as her witness, and I will tell him what I saw." One by one, the villagers stepped forward. Marta, who had delivered her. Elder Henrik, who had fought beside her. Mothers who had hidden their children and now owed their safety to the strategy she had drawn. The line of witnesses grew until Captain Brecken saw that taking the woman by force would mean fighting the very people his lord was supposed to protect. He lowered his hand from his sword. "I will report this to Lord Aldrich," he said. "The decision is his." And then he did something unexpected. He ordered his garrison medics to assist Marta with the wounded, and he posted his riders on the northern perimeter to ensure no Bleakstone stragglers returned. It was not absolution, but it was the beginning of something that might, with time, become mercy. The caravan from the keep arrived 3 days later, carrying not soldiers but a magistrate and a scribe. Lord Aldrich had received the captain's report and had decided that the trial of Lily Ashwood would not be held in a stone hall, but in the village where the crimes and the salvation had both occurred. The hearing took place in the Elder Council chamber, with open doors and every villager permitted to speak. The magistrate, a thin man with careful eyes, listened without interruption as the testimony unfolded. The raid 8 years ago, the stolen children, the pits, the years of conditioning, the killings she had committed under duress, the flight south, the beacon fires, the battle, and Garrick's death. When Callum spoke, he told the story of the leather cord and the lock of hair and the sparrow song. When Toller spoke, he told the story of the moment he had been ready to hand her over and the second he had watched her drive a blade through the monster who had ruined her life. When Marta spoke, she simply held up the midwife ledger with Lily's birth entry and the subsequent death record that she had filed 8 years ago. Because there had been no proof of survival, "I am asking the court to strike the death entry," Marta said. "This woman is not dead. She is alive. And she is not a weapon. She is a person." The magistrate closed the hearing at sunset and asked for a night to consider. The next morning, he announced his ruling. Lily Ashwood was guilty of acts of violence committed as an instrument of the Bleakstone clan, but the law recognized a distinction between a willing perpetrator and a captive coerced under threat of death from childhood. The sentence was not execution, it was clemency, granted on the condition of a lifetime of service to the kingdom's border watch. Lord Aldrich needed scouts who knew the northern passes, who could read orcish signals, who understood the tactics and patterns of the raiders who still threatened the frontier. Lily would serve, not as a prisoner, but as a ranger, her knowledge turned to the defense of the people she had once been forced to terrorize. The surprise that rippled through the village was not the sentence itself, but the quiet detail the magistrate added at the end. The ranger commander who would oversee her service was, by request, Callum Ashwood, reinstated to the rank he had held before the war ended, with a commission to train and lead a new scouting division. The Lord had not just spared his daughter. He had given the tanner his old soldier's life back and a purpose that had room for both of them. That night, In the cottage at the forest's edge, Callum Ashwood sat across from his daughter at a table that had held only one plate for 8 years, and now held 2. The fever had finally broken that morning, and Lily's eyes were clear for the first time since he had found her on the doorstep. She still looked like an orc, and she always would. The alchemy that had altered her skin was permanent, and the scars would never fade. But something else had shifted. The hollow silence that had defined her in the Bleakstone years was filling, slowly, with words. She talked about the Ranger Commission, about the passes she knew, about the children still trapped in the pits that she wanted to find and free. She had become a weapon, and she could not unmake that. But she could decide where the weapon was aimed. That was the difference between a tool and a person. That was the difference Garrick had never understood. They did not speak of the past that night. There would be years for that. Long, quiet years of unraveling the pain and stitching something new in its place. Instead, they talked about the future, about the cottage, which would not be just a hideaway anymore, but a way station for rangers, about the village, which was already calling her by a new name, not the Shadow, but the Watcher of the North. And as the fire burned low and the night settled over the valley like a promise, Callum reached across the table and took his daughter's hand. She did not pull away. She did not flinch. She simply held on, and after a moment, almost inaudibly, she began to hum. The Sparrow Song, the one her mother had taught her, the one that had survived everything. A song is a small thing. It has no blade, no armor, no weight that would register on a blacksmith's scale. But it crossed the Bleakstone pits, the conditioning, the alchemy, and the years of silence that should have erased a child's memory completely. It survived because the things that make us human are not stored in the skin or the teeth or the color of our eyes. They live deeper, in the part of us that hums when we are afraid, that reaches for a familiar hand in the dark, that recognizes a father's smell even when he has aged 8 years and his shoulders have bent under the weight of grief. Callum Ashwood did not save an assassin because he was merciful. He saved her because he saw his daughter's hair, his wife's knotwork, and the shape of a jawline the alchemist could not change. Recognition was the first weapon turned against the lie Garrick had built, and that recognition, once spoken aloud by Marta Fenwick and confirmed by a blacksmith who had every reason to want vengeance, became a chain reaction that no amount of beacon smoke could reverse. The village of Thornwood learned something in those 3 days that most communities never have to confront. The monster at the gate was not a monster. She was a mirror. She was the child they had mourned and buried in absentia, the one they had stopped searching for, because the search hurt too much, and she came back wearing the face of the enemy, because the enemy had stolen her and tried to erase everything she was. It almost worked. It would have worked, if not for a leather cord and a lock of hair and a tanner who never stopped grieving. But the story does not end with a single battle or a single clemency. The Bleakstone stronghold still stands in the northern peaks, and the pits are not empty. Lily was not the only child taken. She was the one who escaped. Somewhere in those frozen halls, other human children, other stolen lives, are being remade into weapons even now, their memories buried under layers of pain and alchemy. And if they ever appear at the gates of a village, they will not be carrying a lock of their mother's hair. They will not have a midwife who remembers the scar on their shoulder. They will be killed before anyone thinks to look for the song. That is why Callum and Lily Ashwood took the Ranger Commission. Not as a punishment, not as a debt to the crown, but as a mission. Every patrol into the northern passes is a chance to intercept a raiding party. Every campfire built in the low smokeless configuration is a signal that trained eyes are watching. And every orc child found in the aftermath of a battle is examined not just for weapons, but for the small brown mole behind the ear, the stitch mark on the shoulder, the melody they hum when they think no one is listening. The Ashwood name, once a marker of tragedy, has become a beacon for the lost. So the question that lingers is not whether Lily Ashwood deserved forgiveness. It is how many other Lilies are still out there, wearing green skin and sharpened teeth, waiting for someone to see past the mask. And whether the rest of us, when they collapse on our doorsteps, will have the courage to drag them inside before the search party comes. If this story stayed with you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments what you would have done when that woman collapsed at your door. We tell stories about the line between monster and human, and how thin it really is. Until next time, keep listening for the song.